This is House Planning Help episode 254. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Jeremy Lent, author of The Patterning Instinct, and we're going to explore what it will take to transition to an ecological civilization. A few times on this podcast, we've had a big picture episode, and this is definitely one of those where we zoom out and just think about how things are going. So Jeremy keynoted the AECB conference, and that's where I caught up with him. I didn't anticipate actually interviewing him, but was given the opportunity and certainly wasn't going to turn it down. What's more, I interviewed Jeremy right after his keynote session, so the whole presentation was fresh in my mind. What I'm trying to do, for the first part at least, is to get Jeremy to summarise the talk and the presentation, and then we open out the conversation. I spend a lot of time thinking about whether I'm doing enough in my own life and hopefully always making little steps in the right direction. But as I watched Jeremy's presentation, I couldn't help but think of that old Victor Hugo quote. You know, the one, "No army can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come." And with everything that's going on in the news at the moment, are we getting closer and closer to that moment where we just realise this can't continue? A lot of us are there already, but, a mass realisation of that point. And just for a bit more added context, Andy Simmons, who is the CEO of the AECB, presented all the latest climate science at the beginning of the conference. The bottom line is, probably you can guess, we've got a long way to go and we're running out of time.
We're still burning more fossil fuels, and the rate of increase of burning fossil fuels is still increasing. So although there are some very good things happening around the world, the sheer scale of that is just not keeping up with the reality of climate change and biosphere breakdown. So we have to face that, and that's the way we started the day, just trying to sort of face those awful realities, really, before we can move forward. Otherwise, we're really just kidding ourselves.
Let's get to my chat with Jeremy Lent, author of The Patterning Instinct. In the face of climate breakdown and ecological overshoot, promises of green growth are not enough. We need to restructure the fundamentals of our global culture and economic system to cultivate an ecological civilization that prioritises the health of living systems over short-term wealth production. Jeremy's work reviews how we've got where we are today and what it will take to change course. I started by asking him to tell me a little bit about his background.
Right now, I'm the author of a book called The Patterning Instinct that just came out a couple of years ago, and it looks at the different ways in which humans structure meaning into the universe and how that's affected the shape of history. So a lot of what I'm writing and talking about nowadays is how our current crisis of civilization we're looking at, the ecological crisis and the climate crisis, have come about not just from a few short-term superficial things in the past, but looking at the underlying ways in which our civilization forms meaning and how that can affect the future. So that's a big focus of my work right now.
How did you start this research then?
Yeah, well, there was actually a part of my life about 10, 15 years ago or so, I went through a real, my own personal crisis. I'd actually had a very different thing that I was doing in my life, the first part of my career. And I actually started an internet company and took it public and was, quite frankly, part of the very system that I'm critiquing right now, like in terms of wealth creation and growth. And then some things happened that caused all that to collapse. My first wife, who passed away some years back, but she got quite sick, and I had to leave this company I'd taken public that was quite new too early. So I left the company to look after her. The company collapsed, and even for years, as I was looking after her, she went through cognitive decline, so I kind of lost the person I had loved and knew, even while she was still alive. And I went through this real deep crisis of meaning in my own life, when it felt like the things I'd built my life around had shattered around me. And I was asking myself, what can I do for the rest of my life that's truly meaningful? But I didn't just want to take somebody else's word for it. So I started to go through this process of years of looking at where these ideas and meaning have come from and wanting to understand what meaning really is and how, and it was only through putting this kind of jigsaw puzzle together I began to realize both how this question of meaning actually has driven what cultures have done, and got to recognize the absolute crisis of meaning and crisis of sustainability our current civilization's on.
So you have gone through some transitions that have been key to civilization up until now. Can you maybe just summarize that? You went into some depth in your talk.
Yeah, well, in real simple terms, there have really only been about like 2 or 3 big transitions in the human experience, the whole sort of way in which our day-to-day lives and sort of ways in which we make sense of things have changed. And for 95% of our ancestors' history as humans, we were living as nomadic hunter-gatherers, really without any meaningful possessions other than just stuff we carried around with us, in small hunter-gatherer bands. And there was a sense of sort of seeing nature as this kind of giving parent, just being connected with nature. And the first big transition came with the rise of agriculture 10 to 12,000 years ago. And a lot of the things that we generally assume have always been part of the human experience only arose then. Ideas like wealth and hierarchy and the patriarchy and the whole ways in which humans specialize into different things, and the above all, this distinction between the value of ownership, that all came just 10 to 12,000 years ago. And that really was part of human civilization in all those times since then, until just the last few hundred years, when in Europe, this scientific revolution arose, which just looked at things in a completely different way. Started to, rather than look at humans as being connected with nature, came this idea of separation from nature and conquering nature. And this idea of nature as a machine got to be fundamental. And even though we don't go around today talking about how we need to conquer nature or nature is a machine, that is actually the sort of fundamental meaning map or meaning metaphor, if you will, that our normal mainstream culture uses to think about things.
Now, what are the problems of these ways of thinking? I mean, were we always going to go down this path, or how does it happen that we go through these transitions?
Yes, well, these kind of new metaphors of nature that came with the scientific revolution, nature as a machine and conquering nature, have led to some of basically all of the advances in science and technology that we all utilize, that we can be also grateful for. I never like to give the impression that I feel there's something bad about that as a development in our sort of human story. The point is that it's brought about these imbalances, that when we think of nature just in this way and that way alone, it's given humanity so much power to disrupt nature that we have led to this place now where we're literally destroying the very earth that we're on by seeing it just as this resource to exploit, and by just seeing it as this machine that has no intrinsic value of its own, and by seeing ourselves as separate from it. So a lot of what I talk about is how we can learn from some of the other ways in which other cultures made meaning out of the world, like the traditional Chinese, who saw humans as being part of like this web of life. And what's so interesting is that actually modern science tells us the same thing. A lot of what we take as the sort of scientific reality or whatever is actually old science that came from thinking from hundreds of years ago, from like the 17th century. And what modern science tells us, like systems science and network science and complexity science and evolutionary biology, is actually we're all interconnected, just like the early hunter-gatherers made sense of the world. But once we begin to see the world in that way, it leads to a very different way of acting, very different assumptions as to what we can do in the future.
You have talked about this ecological civilization. So why might we want to move there, and how might it work?
Right. Well, when we look at our current civilization and where it's headed, the grim reality, and it's hard sometimes to even look at these true implications, is that we've already destroyed most of the global ecology, like living systems, animal populations, and the very natural gifts that humans evolved got on this earth, we're actually destroying. We're using the ocean as basically our toilet, our garbage dump. And what's terrifying is that we are expected to be growing this consumer-based, wealth-based economy and tripling it over the next few decades in a way that's totally unsustainable. So then there's this risk that our whole civilization could just peter out and collapse by just not living sustainably. So the idea of an ecological civilization, it asks this question: what would it look like if we actually transformed the fundamental basis of our civilization from one that's wealth-based and exploitation-based to one that is life-affirming and life-based? And a lot of people out there, and this is work that I get very excited by, are looking at ecology as really a new metaphor, a new way of making meaning for a civilization. Because ecology, as it turns out, can be very resilient to changes and very stable. And a healthy ecology can last for millions of years with all kinds of disruptions happening, but make it through in a healthy way. And the thing is, what principles can we learn from that we could apply to our civilization that could lead us onto a very different path?
What might some of those principles be?
Yeah, well, one would be to recognize above all that the health of all the different parts of a system are required for the system as a whole to be healthy. So in a well-functioning ecology, all the different parts, whether it's the fungal network in the earth or the insects, as well as the sort of big predators and the gigantic trees, all those different parts rely on each other for the whole system to be healthy. If we look at our current wealth-based system, it's the exact opposite. Like the billionaires just want to sort of suck more and more wealth out of the whole system, leading to the fact that billions of people around the world are virtually like just struggling to stay alive to make these billionaires even wealthier. That's the exact opposite of an ecological system. The principle of an ecology-based system is the dignity and health of each person in that economy, in that civilization, is required for the civilization as a whole to be healthy. Imagine what a difference that would look like in terms of reality.
And please continue on those themes as well.
Right, sure. Well, another one is recognition of the circularity of an ecosystem. So, for example, the waste products of any part of an ecosystem actually is the nutrition for another part of that system. So when the trees drop their leaves and they become detritus on the ground, the fungal systems take them up and eat them as nutrition. But those fungal systems themselves then turn the earth into a rich topsoil that then other vegetation can require, which then leads animals to be able to eat the vegetation. So the thing just circles around and around and around. So we can learn from that in our economy. There's this notion of a circular economy where we can retool our manufacturing to actually use as its raw materials, not new stuff mined from the earth, but actually recycled materials, and actually build that recycling and repair into the products. So when a product breaks down, rather than just throw it into the garbage heap and go buy a new one, there would actually be an incentive towards bringing it to a really like a new old crafts group of people who would be specialized in actually having replacement parts for things. So things actually lasted for decades rather than a year or two before we threw them away. That's the idea of a circular economy. And really that can be expanded even to the very notion of consumerism. So when I need something, rather than saying, let me go to the store to buy a new piece of clothing or a new thing, actually say, how can I buy something in the market that's been used before? And a whole shift in value structure based on that.
And I'm going to keep pushing you here to get as much as possible. So anything else? What else was on that? I should have paid more attention and jotted them down so that I could flag them up.
Yeah. Well, another really interesting notion is this notion of reciprocity, that different parts of an ecosystem actually do things that are of reciprocal advantage to the other. So there's this great picture of like a crocodile with a little bird sitting right in the crocodile's jaws. But the crocodile doesn't eat the bird, even though it might be a tasty little morsel, because the bird is actually pulling out little bugs and stuff from the crocodile's teeth. So we can structure a system where what is good for each of us is actually of reciprocal value for others. So we're not actually exploiting others and sucking them dry, but actually doing stuff that other people need. So in some ways, that was the original idea of the sort of market economy that some like Adam Smith came up with, but his ideas have been completely distorted in the last couple of hundred years.
Well, you know my surname. Have you seen? I'm
Right,
distantly related. I think he didn't have a family, so it's from his brother. But yeah, I'm an Adam Smith. Any other principles that come to mind? If not, I will stop pushing you. But
well, I think another one is if we look at the fact that ecologies have lasted for, in some cases, millions of years, and we can apply that to our own thinking, there's this notion of actually building our systems, not so they'll last for 10 years or even for the next generation, but it may be as far as 7 generations out or even beyond that. There's this wonderful quote from the Iroquois Confederacy, a Native American tribe, where they actually say in all of our deliberations, we need to be thinking about what will be the impact on 7 generations from now. That's something like almost 200 years in the future. It's like almost unimaginable for us to even conceive of building anything or thinking about what that future will look like. But that's a transformed way of thinking that's needed for us to really build that sustainable path. So, you might want to plant a grove of trees that might take generations before they actually give the full fruiting that might be possible. And you can, even within our own civilization, we can think back to medieval times when they want to build a cathedral, and people would put blueprints in place knowing that even they'd be long dead before the actual cathedral ever got seen. That's the kind of thinking we need.
The skeptics among us might just say this task is too big. A lot of us just know it needs to change, but have we got the time for that to happen? So you discuss the non-linearity of change, which I think is really interesting. Maybe you could just outline that.
Yes, for sure. And this is a really big issue. And I don't want to give the impression that I'm some sort of optimist who's looking at things and saying, oh, don't worry, however bad it is, we've got this great idea, it's all going to work fine. I actually see what's going on, and I feel as devastated as anybody. And sometimes it's easy to feel into that sense of despair, oh, there's nothing we can do. And I certainly have those feelings at times, but that feeling isn't necessarily actually true, because we live in a world of incredible complexity. We live in a world that is itself nonlinear, which means you can't just look at 2 sort of points in a graph and see that line continuing into the future. In fact, the one thing we know about the way human history works is that nonlinearity, which is both terrifying because the society we're in right now may collapse. That's one very nonlinear direction, but it may also transform. And when we look in history, we see so many examples of things that people said were absolutely impossible, would never happen, and then they actually happened within an amazingly short amount of time, to the point that people say, oh, of course it had to happen, but it was just a matter of time. And, we can look at examples like women's suffrage is a very powerful one, and look at the rise of the civil rights movement in the US, where black people in that country have been massively discriminated against. And laws got passed just a few years after Martin Luther King started to get behind these ideas. And we see that similarly right now in something like the Me Too movement, which has transformed ways in which the male-female relationship is working in workplaces in ways that people didn't think was possible. It still has a long way to go, but really changed some of the thinking. And I think we're seeing that right now in things like the rise of Extinction Rebellion movement in the UK just the last few months. And it was quite dramatic to see them closing down bridges in London and getting the news, and then within just a few days, the Parliament actually passing an act declaring and recognizing a climate emergency. That's the kind of thinking that we need to recognize, that things can transform so fast that it's really like a luxury for maybe affluent people to have, to say, oh, it's all screwed up, nothing I could do, let me just kind of go back to what I'm doing. It's a luxury we can't afford. If we care about our children and our grandchildren, we have to just really say, what can I do to make a difference as part of this transformative change that has to take place? And not even start getting into trying to predict how likely is it. Is it 2% possibility of hope? Is there a 40%? Is it? That's meaningless. What's meaningful is the actual actions we take towards trying to create a hopeful future for those future generations.
You talked about things, for example, the civil rights movement and Rosa Parks being a trigger. Greta, then, we've seen her. Why has she succeeded where, to be fair to the community, we've all wanted this change, we've all wanted to happen, it just doesn't happen. So why has that got traction over anything else? Yeah, well, that's one of those really pointers of this non-linear sort of complex system we all live in. There's something that chaos theorist Edward Lorenz, a question he asked some decades ago when he was actually looking at weather forecasting and realizing you can never predict what's actually going to happen. And it's called the butterfly effect, because he was the one who first asked this question: is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could cause a tornado in Texas? And the point is that he had discovered through his modeling of climate that the tiniest change somewhere could have this outsized effect, just depending on all kinds of variables that were non-predictable. So I think, we could look at somebody like Greta Thunberg and we can come up with theories as to why she was the one rather than somebody else. But I think the important point to take away from it is that when Greta Thunberg went to sit in front of the Swedish parliament all alone, just taking time out of school, saying, I'm on climate strike, she had no clue that within a year, 1.5 million school children would be going out on strike along with her, that she'd be speaking at the UN, at the EU, at the British Parliament, all that stuff. And similarly, each of us, none of us knows the kind of difference that we might be making that can have that dramatic effect. And that's why that realization brings with it a tremendous responsibility. Because, the very actions we take, this very conversation, or just what each of us does each day in deciding to do one thing or another, sometimes can have effects that are not as dramatic as that we saw with Greta Thunberg, and oftentimes effects we don't even know about. We can say something to somebody else, either to a positive or negative way, which they can take, and then see something in a different way, which they transfer to somebody else, and somebody else gets transformed in their way of thinking, who then goes on to make some major change. And we might discover that change years later, have no idea that something that you or I did actually had an impact that led to that. And so that gives this sense both of hope and a real sense of responsibility that each of us is involved in this web of life in creating the future that we all care about. I see a lot of the work that I do through the internet, because it's just how things have evolved, and making content that brings together a community. So what potential does the internet have? My gut feeling says it's almost like a brain that we're creating. So how could it help us, if this question makes any sense at all?
Oh, I think it makes so much sense. I just couldn't agree more about the importance of the internet. In fact, it's quite possible, if our civilization does make it through this crisis right now, and we have a long-term future to look back on, that the rise of the internet may be viewed as a bigger change maybe than the rise of writing, and maybe almost as big, or maybe as big as the rise of language, the very emergence of language, like this huge fundamental shift in this human ability to communicate with each other. And I do think that it leads to a different way of understanding ourselves as really like a human superorganism, where we really are truly all connected, and the actions that we all do make a difference to this whole system. And right now we're seeing some we're more aware of some of the negative effects of the internet. So you have this kind of scale effect where a few big networks owned by these billionaires who became billionaires because of this system which they founded the technology, like Facebook and Google, Apple, Amazon, etc. So we have this system of these incredible inequalities that have brought about from that, and we're all only too aware of the rise in silos that arises from things like Facebook and memes going around and people getting told and fake news and lies and then just looking for reinforcing information that can keep them in their silos. So right now, if anything, people might be thinking of the internet more as a force that has led to actually a siloization or separation between different groups. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Right now, that's what we're looking at. But I think that misses the more fundamental point that the internet has the potential and is actually connecting us all as humans in a way that has never happened before. And I think that Tim Berners-Lee, the original founder of the internet, is working with other people right now to really try to come up with a kind of like an internet 2.0, looking at are there ways to structure the way the web and the internet actually works to avoid some of the pitfalls we've seen and try to actually have much more of that sort of network effect that, I mean, really we can all be so grateful for already. It's really transformed each of our lives in just the last couple of decades.
One of the slides that you showed talked about 26 billionaires having nearly half the planet's worth of wealth. Yeah. And we've talked also about not necessarily the good versus the bad, but what if these people, who I think are to some degree our principal people, wanted to bring about this change? Your Bill Gates types of people, could they do it? They've got the power, but what would they have to do? They have to dismantle the system.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that we are not going to see the changes that are needed in our society coming from those people who profited so much from the society itself with its problems. So basically, if the sort of fox is stealing hens from the hen house, you don't sort of turn to the fox and say, can you come into this hen house and like try to solve this problem for us? And I think that it's quite possible that some of these billionaires, people like Bill Gates, are truly driven by a sense of ethical responsibility. I'm not really questioning his sense of wanting to do good in the world and realizing some of these things that have come about. But the point is that having developed his way of making meaning from a system that has given him this incredible power and wealth, it's virtually impossible for him to actually question the fundamentals of that system as a form of good. So Bill Gates and many people in that kind of ethos go around looking for ways to fix the system within this kind of neoliberal market economy. So they look for market solutions because the market worked for them, so it means that it's got to work for other people. And they specifically don't want to look at solutions that look at the very structure of the society that led to these inequities in the first place. And they'll spend a lot of time trying to rationalize that. Steven Pinker is the writer of a book that tries to argue about how we're actually, all these things of the system have actually led to the world being a better place than it used to be. And there's no question that I personally agree that the world has improved significantly, both in terms of people's material life and even our value systems over the centuries. But I would not put that down to this market-based neoliberal capitalist economy. I think that's a false impression to make, and that's the kind of solutions that these people are always trying to give us. That's one reason why we can't look to those people. But there's a second reason, which is that the solutions that we need actually look at a different paradigm, a paradigm where we don't have these kind of usually white male heroes, like the sort of an Elon Musk who swoops in and creates some new industry and says, I'm going to transform that. They can do good things. I'm not saying that like a transformed auto industry that actually leads to the possibility of mass marketing of total electric cars is not a bad thing. It's great. But we're not going to actually get to this kind of ecological civilization based on these kind of solitary heroes. It's actually a community-based thing. It's through all of us, millions of us together, looking at connecting with each other, actually living with our hearts, caring about those around us, and not necessarily saying, I'm the one who's going to change the world, but saying, I'm going to change the lives of those people around me right now. And also looking at how we can uplift the work that others around us are doing that looks like really good stuff that we want to. So not just focusing on what can I do that really works for me because I've got the solution. Go, I have a solution maybe, and so does. And how can I lift that up? So together as a self-organized, almost like hive mind, like you said, and with this notion of the internet as this connective tissue between us, those are the kind of changes that will lead to this ecological civilization, because one of the things that we discover from ecology is that it's self-organized. When you look at something like the Amazon forest as an ecology that's been around for millions of years, it's not like there was a few animals got together a few million years back and said, okay, we're going to work out this ecology, this is how it's going to work. They did their thing, and the insects did their thing, the fungus did its thing, and they worked together, sometimes in competition, but more often actually in cooperation. But a combination of those both working together in all these different factors, being open to changes, working out how they can do stuff as a whole to lead to this ecology working. That's how we're going to really get to that transformation that we need, is working together with each other, recognizing the values other people have, and just working as a group, seeing that it's that group dynamic that is more important than any one leader.
Yeah, I would just underline that 100%. Time. We knew a lot of this back in the day, or a certain proportion of society did and wanted these changes. It hasn't happened, and we started off the day at this conference looking at just numbers and things. Andy Simmons talking about how we've got 9 years to avoid a 1.5 Celsius increase. We'll all go on and we're going to do our bit as we've discussed, but do we have time? If we don't, can we create this ecological civilization the other side, or does it just look very different then?
Yeah, that's a huge factor, and it comes back to this question of, well, that can easily lead to despair, saying, this is like, give me a break, this is just not even doable in this kind of time frame. But something that we also need to realize is it's not like there's this kind of one line. It's not like, and when the IPCC says that we have 12 years to turn things around, I think it's very important to take that 12 years very seriously, because they're looking at models and they're saying it just becomes inconceivable to get to that 1.5 degrees in any other form if we don't do that. But the point is, it's not like there's this one line and on, February the 2nd, 12 years from now, suddenly, okay, it's all over, the world ends, the lights go out. The next day, everything's still there. And then we got to realize that even if we fail to get to that 1.5, which is so crucial, then we've got to do everything we can to not get to the 2 degrees Celsius. And even if we fail that, we've got to do everything we can to get to the 2.2 Celsius. The point is that life keeps going. New children keep getting born. Species keep going extinct. Every time, it's not like it's all over on that time. There's millions of animals, creatures out there. There's ecosystems that need saving. And every single thing we can do, no matter how desperate it looks, is important to save whatever we can. And this thing about time, what's so interesting about it, is that as this current system begins to unravel because of its all these instabilities that we've been describing, the irony is that actually allows for the transformative change to happen more rapidly than it ever could have when the system was stable. So if the system's stable, everything is going fine, and somebody's getting these banners saying, we need a new system. Everyone goes, yeah, sure. Like everything's fine. Why should I bother? But when everyone knows that things are falling apart, and when school kids are going on strike saying, I want a future, and somebody's coming along saying, we need a new system, suddenly everyone's turning around saying, yeah, tell me more about it, because we know we need that. And so the unraveling of this current system, and don't get me wrong, I'm not wanting it to unravel. I would love things to be really like move in a nice, smooth, positive way towards that the future that we want. But given that it is unraveling because of these inconsistencies and instabilities, it does allow more possibility of that transformational change in much more rapid time than we ever would have dreamed possible.
Well, great work, and keep it up, please. I don't know, what is your vision then for using this material, proliferating it?
Yeah, well, I think probably the most important thing is the kind of thing that you're doing right now with this podcast is like saying, and I so applaud what you're doing, saying like, what can I do to amplify these ideas, to actually just put out there in the world, like different ways of being that are possible. And I really ask anybody who's listening to this podcast to just get to really feel into this notion that it's not like each of us are separate from everything we've just been talking about. We are the very system that we've just been talking about. And each of us, what we choose to do in our lives, the way that we make decisions from one day to the next, the way we raise our kids, the ways in which we relate to others at work, all of these things actually are making a difference right now in the system. So the future is not something that's out there that is separate from us, but each of us are part of creating that future right now in what we do.
Jeremy, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Ben. Thanks.
Get more in today's show notes, which you'll find at houseplanninghelp.com/254, where there's a summary of our conversation. Also, we've included a few of Jeremy's slides from his AECB keynote. No doubt the full version will be at the AECB's website. Of course, we'll link you across there. We'll link you to Jeremy's website and point you in the direction of where you can get hold of a copy of the book. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, there are obviously big thoughts today. We'd love to hear it. Just scroll down to the bottom of the show notes. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/254. Quick hub update just to finish on. And since we've been talking about the AECB and the conference, well, actually, that's where our conference call for our community members came from this month. We were live down there chatting to Andy Simmons. Our discussion included climate change because he's read a lot of the science behind it and had that job of presenting it to us at the beginning of the conference. We talk about the work of the AECB. They always welcome self-builders at the conferences and just trying to help them on their journey. Key takeaways too. What were the ones that really stood out? And of course, what we try and do here all the time is how does that convert to us as self-builders wanting to build a great house? What can we learn? So all of that in my chat with Andy Simmons. We also caught up with Alex Baines. Now, Alex's project Long Barrow was our first in-depth video case study, and Alex got into financial difficulty, so the project is still halfway through. We catch up with him. He's always very optimistic. However, this time he reveals that he's even thought about selling the site. So quite a big interview. What I love about Alex is no matter what he goes through, he's always positive, and things, for example, he's opening up his house to the Passive House Trust open days, which you think, you've got enough on your plate. Do you really want to be doing this? But he's always happy to share, and we've learned so much from some of the harder times that he's had on his project, and he's very candid in his chat. So that you'll find in the archive, houseplanninghelp.com/join if you're not a member and you're interested about signing up. Next time, Chris Herring from Green Building Store is my guest, and we're going to be looking at how you specify the right high-performance windows. If you're building a low-energy home, windows are going to be important, so we'll get everything that you need to know in next time's podcast. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.